It's really my pleasure to introduce now Dr. David Burbach. Dr. Burbach is an associate professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. He teaches on African regional security, U.S. grand strategy, and defense planning. And he is a political scientist specializing in international relations and the politics of U.S. foreign policy. The title of his presentation, as we see here, is For All Mankind, Seeking a Sustainable Space Politics. Dr. Burbach.
Thank you very much, Irina. And also thank you to Framingham State and the Smithsonian for sponsoring this. And actually, I greatly appreciate Dr. Hirsch's talk, because I think this actually does follow on pretty well. What I'll be talking about today is trying to dig a little more deeply into understanding the political support for the space program, both in the Apollo era, the Cold War period that followed, and how things stand today, and a few concerns that I have about, where we may see some negative trends as well as some of the many positive trends that we see today. Because fundamentally, space has always been about politics. We went to the moon because of international and domestic politics. Throughout, even until very recently, space spending was dominated by federal spending, and that's likely to continue. For all that we see happening with SpaceX, with Blue Origin, with the various commercial enterprises, if we go back to the moon, if we go back to Mars, if we go to Mars with robotic or human spaceflight, it's likely to be government funding, even if we're paying contractors to do it for us. So understanding, what makes people support space, how much support there is, how that's likely to evolve is going to be critical, because like it or not, this is going to fundamentally be a mostly government endeavor for the foreseeable future, even if there are some very generous billionaires now interested in supporting it. So to start off, as the previous speaker outlined, we ended up with this moon landing out of Cold War competition. If you go back to the late 1950s, John F. Kennedy, as a senator, actually was one of the leading proponents of a concept known as the missile gap, the idea that the Soviets had gotten ahead of us on long-range missile technology, were building more missiles than us. And in fact, Kennedy staked his political reputation on competing with the Soviets in high technology such as missiles. So when Kennedy was faced with the challenge of the Soviets achieving the first human space flight, the apparent, you saw the clips from the Right Stuff of all of our rockets blowing up. Well, the Soviets didn't release footage when theirs blew up, so it kind of looked like we weren't doing so well. So Kennedy, as somebody who had campaigned and came to office on why is President Eisenhower allowed the Soviets to catch ahead, Kennedy may not have been terribly interested in space, but politically, it would have been very difficult for Kennedy to say, well, Eisenhower was actually right. It doesn't matter very much. We don't have to worry. So unsurprisingly, Kennedy committed the country to a race to go to the moon. This is a Time magazine cover from 1968, when we had not, at that point, we didn't know yet that the Soviet N-1 rocket was never going to pan out. We spent a while pretty concerned that year that the Soviets might still have a chance of beating us. But looking back on it now, it's easy to think that this was a project to which the country was deeply committed, that everyone agreed we had to go to the moon. How could we not all share and want to join in this tremendous goal? But even during this period that we look on as the golden age of spaceflight, support was certainly not universal. A political cartoon from the late 1960s shows, U.S. space progress contrasted with U.S. progress in race relations, which was not so good. And in fact, there actually was, even in the 1960s, political opposition to Apollo. I've featured here from the left. I'll talk about conservative opposition a bit too. Some of you may have seen the movie First Man featuring Neil Armstrong's flight. There's a scene in there where they show some protesters outside the launch site. They're portrayed in the movie as, sort of, hippie type protesters who seem to mostly be protesting the risk to the astronauts' lives. Well, there actually was a protest, just before the Apollo 11 launch, led by Reverend Abernathy, shown there, meeting with NASA Director George Payne, but really focusing on the issue of why are we spending so much money on this space mission when there are so many problems in the U.S. that have not been addressed. The civil rights movement and opposition to it in full force, and it reflected, in fact, concern for many on the left that we were spending a lot of money on, going to the moon and ignoring problems on Earth. That's fairly young Senator Walter Mondale, future vice president. Political scientist Amitai Etzioni, as early as 1964, wrote a book called Moondoggle, saying it was going to be a tremendous waste of money. There were much better things we could do, even technologically better things that we could do. And on the conservative side as well, there was a significant sense that it wasn't, we were spending more money than the program was worth. I've got here some polling data that now retired NASA historian Roger Launius has done a great job compiling polls from historically. And if you look, although if you ask the public, do you approve of Apollo? Merely asking, do you think it's a nice idea? Support usually was pretty strong. When you asked, is it worth the money, or are we spending too much on it? The results were a lot more mixed. Is Apollo worth the cost? The blue line that you see, only right around the moment of the Apollo 11 landing did that ever reach a majority saying, yes, it was worth the cost. The number of people saying that we were spending too much, consistently, in the 30% range, and after the first landing, increasing pretty sharply. And my own research, where surprisingly, people haven't really, scholars haven't really dug into this polling data to look more carefully at who thought what and why. Some analysis that I'm working on, there actually is a pretty significant conservative share as well. When you look at, people who say that we're spending too much, and you see, what do they say their political ideology is? What's their opinion on taxes? Why do they say they're opposing the program? Even on the right, it may not have been as organized or as prominent in our memory as some of the protests from the left, but there was significant opposition even at the time. And what really stands out when you look at the data is, the gender and especially racial gaps, where just a week after the moon landing, when the Harris polling firm asked, although at that point about 60 to 70% of white Americans said that they thought it had been worth the cost, only 20% of non-white women and 30% of non-white men agreed. And in fact, from the polls that I've looked at, support, that racial gap steadily increased throughout the 1960s. NASA did worse and worse over time. So even at the time of the moon landing, in terms of, if you think about the sustainability of the politics, even at the height of the Cold War, there was a great deal of skepticism about the amount of money being spent, and definitely a sense that this was not something that was necessarily benefiting or contributing to all Americans. So what happened with space politics after Apollo? Well, it's been a struggle for decades, a struggle to find a new mission. And, I would argue that national security and national prestige continued to really be the strong focus. Even at the level of scientific missions, in terms of what resonated with the political establishment or the public, we need to demonstrate technological leadership. We need to show that we're still competitive with the Soviets. And beyond sort of those reasons, I say presidential stamp, constant redirection is a summary for, if presidents were going to get something politically out of the space program, it needed to be their goal. John F. Kennedy said, go to the moon. NASA has suffered through several decades, still ongoing, of every new administration, if they were interested in NASA, the way to support that, the way that a president will typically look at space is, what can I accomplish that will be my legacy? And so there's been a pattern of, constant redirections with new administrations, pressure to support jobs in various states, NASA centers, contractors, and within NASA itself, perhaps because of some of these larger identity issues, a certain amount of bureaucratic inertia. And post-Apollo, the public continued to, not be terribly supportive of the space program, not strongly opposed. But if you look at this, uses a long-running survey that social scientists make a lot of use of, called the General Social Survey. It's asked since the early 70s about support for various federal programs. The number of people who've said that we are spending too little on space, i.e. who say, let's spend more, and I'll show the most recent few years in a minute. Usually it's bounced just above 10%, with majorities of the public saying, let's spend less. So, if you ask the public, are you proud of the space program? Do you have a favorable opinion of NASA? The public will say, oh yeah, that's great. You willing to pay something for it? Not so much. It's easy to say you like NASA. Saying you're willing to see your tax dollars go there has been somewhat more problematic. So during the Cold War, what I've found to be a good predictor, looking at polling data of support for space spending, is the national security argument. And I've got here a photo. If the photo of a space shuttle with mountains in the background seems a little disorienting because, Florida doesn't have many mountains, we actually were planning to have fully military shuttle missions launched from a military base, Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. After the Challenger disaster, we pulled the plug and decided not to do that. But the space shuttle was intended to be a military vehicle as well as a science and exploration vehicle. And there were a number of shuttle missions that were in fact classified, carried out entirely by astronauts who were in the military. The Ronald Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative to do missile defense from space, even that's a recent photo of astronauts heading up to ISS, Russian, British, and American. But even the cooperative things that we did tended to be when we, at periods when our relations with the Soviet Union were good, or in the post-Cold War era, when we wanted to cement better relationships with Russia, and also make sure that Russian scientists had jobs that were, better than, say, being hired by North Korea or Iran. We put money into cooperation, but still fundamentally driven by these foreign policy concerns. And just to give you a sense of how that mattered, this using that General Social Science Survey data from the 1980s, I found that people who wanted higher military spending were much more likely to want to maintain or increase spending on the space program than individuals who wanted to reduce defense spending. True for both parties. But at the time, it was generally the case that Republicans were in favor of more military spending, the Reagan buildup, Democrats opposed. So in the Cold War era, you saw a pretty large partisan split. NASA seemed to be associated in people's minds with the military complex, with national security concerns. And so a lot of space opinion came down to, are you a hawk or a dove, generally on foreign policy? And more generally, it's been hard to build support because, again, I mentioned, I have here the both President Bush's junior father and son rolling out their signature space initiatives. If you are thinking, what was the George W. Bush Space Exploration Initiative and what was that all about? That's a reasonable question because it didn't end up amounting to very much. Likewise for his son, or rather George H.W. Bush, for W. Bush, rolled out the Vision for Space Exploration in 2004 in the wake of the Columbia disaster, not unlike the previous one following Challenger. This time setting a goal of returning to the moon, as well as developing nuclear power for larger scale planetary exploration. That again ended up not really going very far. You can see the X-33 single stage to orbit craft that the Clinton administration invested in that also did not pan out, or the current SLS launch system that NASA is developing that makes very heavy use. In fact, if it looks a little reminiscent of what if you took a space shuttle and stuck an Apollo capsule on top of it, you wouldn't be entirely wrong, as kind of a first guess of where it comes from. NASA was directed, and NASA internally had interest in making maximum use of space shuttle facilities, technology, and space shuttle contractors and NASA employees reusing a lot of the material. That makes a lot of political sense, while it's probably not technically the way to go. What I have found looking at a variety of polling data for the last 10 years or so is, while there's certainly no clamor that, oh my gosh, we've got to go to Mars, we've got to go back to the moon, support for space has been quietly creeping up. And in fact, I was about to say back up, but really it's higher than any post-Apollo levels ever. I mean, it's been relatively quiet, but it seems like this may actually be a relatively good era in terms of political support for space, for a variety of reasons. For one thing, the public has become a little more liberal and generous towards federal spending. If you ask generally, are you willing to increase spending on education, healthcare? We're in a slightly liberal mood. But beyond that, my read of the data, and I'm speculating on some of these, is that there does seem to be more interest and focus on science. You can see that in our focus on STEM education, in students' career choices. There seems to be a lot of excitement generated by robotic missions. I mean, the sense used to be that the way people get excited is they see heroic astronauts strapping themselves into a rocket and going to do heroic things in space. If you ask kids today, what do they want to do? Astronaut is actually pretty low on the list. More of them say they want to be a scientist than want to be an astronaut. Think about, if you remember when, the Opportunity rover finally, was lost in a dust storm 2 years ago. I mean, there were, all over social media, people were saying goodbye, and, people have really gotten invested in some of the robotic missions, I think more than used to be the case. And I defer to others who, study, do cultural studies more than me, if there's something about our sort of online lives that matter there. Race and gender gaps in support have narrowed. They're still quite prominent, but they have narrowed. The gap between, space is still, highest support for white, male, young, highly educated, high income. I mean, all of those variables are significant. But race and gender gaps have narrowed somewhat, and I think that contributes to support coming up somewhat. And also, one of the things that I've argued in a recent paper is that for Democrats, it's now, or liberals, the two track pretty well, it's now less likely for them to see space in a military context and more likely to associate with environmental protection. And I find that, today, support for environmental protection is a pretty good predictor of supporting space. And just to, this actually got addressed. I appreciate the question with the previous speaker that got at this. There has long been a connection. I'm showing the Earthrise image here, and the a poster from the 1970s. Love Mother Earth with and that's not the Earthrise photo, but the Earth from space became a real touchstone for the environmental movement. But that connection wasn't as strong in the 1970s as it might have been. There definitely was interest within NASA. But even within NASA, there were some leaders who like, this is a fad. It's all, hippies and radicals. And certainly in terms of trying to sell environmentalism to the Nixon or Ford White House, or to Congress at the time, that didn't go very far. But on the other side too, the environmental movement of the 1970s had a much stronger anti-technology attitude to it than I think it does today, where space was sometimes seen as part of the problem, tied to the military-industrial complex. As recently as the 1990s, the top photo, the one in color, shows protests against the launch of the Cassini Saturn probe in the 1990s because it carried plutonium. Actually, the first thing I ever had published was a letter to the Los Angeles Times saying, when there were protests about the Galileo launch in the late 1980s, I wrote a letter to the editor, and they actually ran it saying, this would be like if Columbus was afraid of the magnetic compass. So I mean, it's the relationship between environmentalism, environmental protection, and space wasn't as strong as we see it today. In fact, the New York Times had an editorial when NASA was pushing the idea of using remote sensing satellites for land use monitoring, like, it could help with cities to identify land use patterns and how they're changing. The New York Times actually said, look, how is putting a camera in space going to show us slums any better? We know there are slums, and the way you solve the problem is by spending money on the cities, not on space. We don't need better pictures of cities. Whereas today, we're more inclined to say, you can learn a lot through deep data analysis like that. So what I find now is that I find lower correlations between wanting higher military spending and whether somebody is in favor of more spending on space or not. But for Democrats, a very strong effect of what they think about spending on the environment. And in fact, most Democrats are in favor. So, rather than, there's been that partisan gap that had long been present in the post-Apollo Cold War has narrowed considerably as support for Democrats has increased. And in other surveys, you can see this interest in environmental protection or planetary protection. I know one of our later speakers is going to talk about asteroid defense. If you ask people, what do you think was important for NASA to do? What do you think is important for the space program to do? Consistently, things that benefit us here on Earth are what top the list, or pure science. You can see in a poll from earlier this year, looking for dangerous asteroids top this particular list. This particular one did not break out climate change or environment, but knowledge to expand what we know of Earth and the solar system. Way down at the bottom, go back to the moon, establish a human presence in space, or at the very bottom of the list, establish a U.S. military presence in space. Another poll, this one, which interestingly had a generational breakdown, found the same thing, that monitoring to understand environmental changes, the issue that got the highest level of support. National security, a pretty strong generational difference, where baby boomers, were still pretty interested in national security, while millennials were really not so moved by concern about national security issues. And again, way down at the bottom of the list, human mission to Mars or a human mission to the moon. So what I take from this about politics today, there's a lot of you photo SpaceX boosters returning or the Mars InSight landing. There's a lot of cool stuff happening. This is a great time for space technology. And it's actually, in many ways, I think, a pretty good time for space politics. This is the most supportive the public has been in a while. Some trends that I think, while nobody's saying let's fund a crash program to send people to Mars, this is probably a better, relative to the 1970s, when there was sort of an active backlash to all the money spent on Apollo, opposition to big institutional technology products. There's a lot of opportunity now. I do have a couple of concerns where I think the politics may become more difficult, and that's partisanship and sort of how how rerunning Apollo in today's political environment may not go so well. The increasing emphasis on military applications from the current administration, or what I call the techno-utopianism of, it's easy to point at Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, but this is a much broader phenomenon. Going back into the 1970s, you can see arguments about, we'll move humanity to giant space colonies. And I think in the very long term, that's great, but I have some concerns about what that means for current politics. For the, as I'm sure you know, the Trump administration has set a goal of returning humans to the moon by 2024, which would be the end of Trump's second term if he's reelected. And so I phrase this as, is this about humanity returning to the moon or Trump returning to the moon? Because we know we live in an environment today that has become very strongly partisan. We political scientists observe a phenomenon we call negative partisanship, which essentially boils down to, if the other side likes it, you're against it. If it's something that you used to be in favor of, but the other side now comes out in favor of it, you're even likely to change your opinion. We've seen this on a bunch of issues. Democrats have swung strongly pro-free trade since Trump was elected and on a protectionist platform. Republican opinion towards Russia has shifted dramatically since 2016. We know that when initiatives become closely identified with either a political party or a partisan politician, the issue itself becomes inherently polarized. So if the moon mission becomes really seen as a political initiative, that the goal is woman, man, and NASA has said they definitely will have, it's not going to be an all-male crew for sure this time. But if the goal is to put somebody back on the moon while Donald Trump is president, that's not going to build support among Democrats in Congress or Democrats in the public very well. And given the relatively low level of support for the concept itself, if this gets portrayed as a political stunt, I'm worried that it will expand to the point that people will say, never mind, I don't like NASA so much anyway. It's just a vehicle to further the president's ambitions. And to date, I actually do give credit that I think Administrator Bridenstine and NASA as a whole have managed to not portray this as politically as might have been the case. We'll see what happens at the White House level. But given the low public support for the return to the moon mission, I do worry that it'd be a little easy for this to become overly politicized. The other big initiative from this administration is a growing emphasis on military uses of space. You've probably heard about the proposal to create Space Force as a brand new military service, first new service since the Air Force in 1947. Even if that doesn't happen, and in fact, as we speak, it's one of the stumbling points in getting agreement between the House and the Senate on a defense spending bill for next year. But even if we don't create Space Force, the administration has set a considerably more aggressive policy towards how we view space for U.S. national security. You can see Vice President Pence said that America can't simply be present, it must dominate space. Our space strategy says that we'll project military power to, from, and within space in support of our national interests. And in general, that we'll think of space as another warfighting domain, and we'll look upon it as a primary area for conflict and cooperation, conflict and competition with other powers. And again, given this is not something the American public is sold on yet. And in fact, if you look at polling data on the Space Force proposal specifically, there's a very sharp partisan split. You get something like 60% support among Republicans, 20% support among Democrats. And to the extent that the administration casts space as space is about international competition, space is about military conflict. My concern is that that's not something that's going to resonate. And in the without going down the whole track of how to think about space combat, space is very easy to break. In a sense, there's tremendous opportunity for international cooperation, but because it's so easy to destroy satellites, it's impossible to, is building a new rocket engine about sending a robotic mission to Mars, or is it about building an anti-satellite weapon? It's the same technology. You cannot distinguish between military and civilian technologies very easily. So to the extent that we cast space is all about competition, it naturally means, well, do we want to work with China on exploring the moon? Well, maybe they'll learn something about our technology that would be dangerous. Maybe, it becomes very difficult to have the constructive, cooperative relationships that we often have had. Then the final concern that I'll leave you with is, as I said, there are amazing things happening in the space industry from the commercial sector, new technologies, new ideas. Time actually recently ran, based on their 1968 cover, a new one showing private companies competing to get to the moon. And the visions of of the new space sector are very expansive. Elon Musk has talked about 1 million people living on Mars in the not so distant future, building Martian cities. He still says he wants to send 100-person missions to Mars within the lifetimes of most of us in this room. Jeff Bezos from Amazon has expressed even more expansive visions, miles-wide space colonies where trillions of human beings might live off-planet. A more distant vision than what Musk is saying, but also nothing new. In fact, if any of those of you who know some of the history, Gerard O'Neill and the L5 Society in the 1970s, but I remember exactly the same National Geographic article that it's clear Jeff Bezos read in the mid-1970s, showing how we were all going to live in space colonies. He actually studied with O'Neill at Princeton. So, this is a vision that goes back decades. And I think it's great to be ambitious. But when you really think about what this means politically, how many of us are actually going to benefit from this? Is this going to be, a billionaire resort in space? If hundreds of thousands of people or hundreds of people go to Mars, who are those going to be? And what about the 8 billion rest of us? When do we get to go? What does it mean for us? And if the technologies exist to really put 1 trillion people in space, even Bezos will admit his giant colonies assume you have like self-replicating robots that can, you drop one on an asteroid and it turns it into steel ingots and sends them somewhere. If you've got that kind of technology, think of what you'd be able to do on Earth too. If you can terraform Mars, it's a lot easier to terraform Earth than to terraform Mars. So when I hear these visions, it's exciting, but I also wonder, are we leaving out focus on solving problems here on Earth, even the insurance against a disaster? Or, Musk, for example, often cites, well, if World War III happens, the Martian colony can come back and recolonize Earth and, rebuild it after a war. What I wonder there is, first of all, is a Mars colony really going to be that self-sufficient that quickly? But also, why are we assuming that wars aren't going to happen on Mars or with space colonies, or that our war isn't going to extend, or that we're just out of spite, we lob a couple of nuclear weapons at the space colony, or the Mars base too? And what kind of the larger perspective there is, there's an assumption from many of these visions that politics in space will be easy. Musk has said, oh, we'll just do direct democracy combined with like AI figuring stuff out so we don't have to do politics. And, I wonder, this seems like a fairly naive view of human nature to me. If any of you have read Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy from the late 1990s, one of the things I think he gets right is his extremely smart professional astronaut type people go to Mars, and within a couple of decades, they are fighting, they are literally having civil wars on Mars and being, conniving, violent people, the way we know human beings tend to be, because, some of us simply want power, want more than we have. But there's an implication there that sort of makes you say, well, is it that we're going to send the right people to Mars? We're going to send the right people to the space colonies? We're going to leave the troublemakers on Earth? That the problem is, well, some people are just impossible, but we'll make sure the right people go into space? or that Earth institutions, our political institutions, are so broken, so hopeless, we geniuses will design new ones in space that will work. It seems to me that inherently these visions where everything will just be perfect in space, we know human societies are rarely perfect, so why is yours going to be perfect? And what does that say about your view of the rest of us? Which, as I say, again, suggests exclusion, abandonment. And what I worry is that in some ways, we're clearly not going to have, miles wide, trillion person space colonies soon. But to the extent that people say, I don't need to worry about politics on Earth because politics on Earth is stupid and there are a lot of people, who just cause trouble. Because in a couple of decades, I'll get on one of Elon Musk's ships and go to Mars. The focus on the utopianism, may give us reason to sort of withdraw from politics on Earth, write it off. So, what I would encourage on this note is that I hope youth do not take, I don't need to worry about how things are going here because I'll be able to take a ship to Mars pretty soon. That's, I would take from it instead, ask how can space be used to make more equal, more environmentally protected, more prosperous and healthy societies on Earth. And I think, that sort of focus will lead to a more sustainable in the sense of what's done and sustainable in the sense of maintaining political support. So, I would love, this is the Earth scene from the Spirit rover on Mars 15 years ago now. I would certainly love to go and see that myself. But recognize fundamentally our future is still going to be here on Earth for a very long time. So thank you.
Again, we'll be taking questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you. So your thoughts on maybe two things.
Mm-hmm.
I find it encouraging the growth in the support for space exploration and funding based on environmentalism and whatever. But, well, the disconnect between the current administration and that support, I'm just wondering your observation on that. The other thing is, back when I was an undergrad in the early 80s, one of my friends was a physics major, and he was working on a Reagan's SDI initiative. MIT, they got some funding for it. And I'm like, how can you, what are you doing working on this? And he's like, listen, we all know it's not going to work, but basically the money is funding basic research. So we're taking the money, we're doing our basic research, and we're not worried because it's never going to come to pass. So I'm also wondering, particularly with the NASA strategy now under Trump, with Trump going in certain directions, if part of it is just kind of, yeah, we'll play the game, to be honest, but you mentioned the technology is useful both for, you can't separate the technology. So is it just kind of this pragmatic sense of, we'll take the money, we'll do our research, it doesn't matter what the argument from the top is, we're still using it for a good purpose?
Sure. Let me take those in reverse order. On the smaller NASA question, I give NASA credit that when designing their moon program, optimizing, NASA says we don't want to do a plant a flag, go home over again. We want to build a system that's going to lead to long-term exploration, habitation, which is somewhat in conflict with the political goal of get there as quickly as possible. My sense is NASA is trying to thread that pretty carefully, that they're not, at least not yet, doing the things that would say, well, we'll just do the quick and dirty and easy way. I think they are actually trying to, out of this renewed focus, using it as an opportunity to develop some new technologies. There are plenty of people at NASA who would like to get out of being so committed to the SLS as the launch vehicle, and I think this has given them some of an opportunity to, say, let's look more broadly, at launch systems. So I think, so far at least, NASA, I think, seems to be making reasonably good use of the opportunity and not narrowly focusing on, oh my gosh, it's got to be by 2024. If Trump's reelected and he has more of a direct stake, we have seen the president is willing to reach into agencies and impose changes in a somewhat unpredictable way. So that's hard to say. The larger disconnect, it's the priorities of that are coming out of the White House are not the ones that enjoy broad political support, either from the public or, the Democrats in Congress are very skeptical of Space Force. Most people in Congress were skeptical until a couple of years ago. So and this is not, this is not the early 1960s when it wasn't so hard to get things through. I mean, these days, just passing the regular budget so we repeat last year's fiscal year without a shutdown, that's challenging. So, I'm still not sure what they're going to get. And yeah, I think, that's kind of my overall worry, that, it's a fairly supportive period for space, but the administration is pushing on exactly the directions that are probably the least popular.
Thank you. Going back to the period of the Apollo program, you mentioned earlier that that was a part of the project's good benefits was a lot of employment around the country was distributed. And so I'm asking, what is today's NASA compared to another WPA project?
Well, I mean, just could you elaborate? Like, should we think about NASA like the WPA, or?
Well, do they think themselves, or do the politicians consider the NASA as a means of distributing work around the country in a uniform way so to support our growth?
I think yes and no. I think because in the 1960s, what was easy was these centers didn't exist yet. So you were in the business of handing out goodies. And actually, Lyndon Johnson absolutely conceived of the space program as a way to spur economic development in the South that would be in a more high-tech variety than had been seen there before. There's a story that Cambridge, Massachusetts was going to get mission control, and then MIT lost out to Texas after Kennedy was shot. That's not quite true, but LBJ absolutely, some of the reason NASA is so centered in the South was a deliberate economic development strategy that Johnson in particular pushed. Today, if NASA's budget is not increasing or not increasing much, if you were to help any part of the country that doesn't already have a NASA center, it implies that you're taking money away from somebody. And so, the politics now is much more of a zero sum. We know, for example, Senator, people have sometimes called the SLS the Senate launch system, or even the Shelby launch system, because it's so closely identified with Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama, who's made it pretty clear that, you can go wherever you want in space, but it's going to be on a rocket built in Huntsville, Alabama. So there's a lot of protection of existing, and in fact, I think I believe SpaceX even is planning to build some sort of facility in Alabama too. Or even some of the commercial companies have realized, it'll be politically easier if they if they focus on some of the same states that already have this political connection. So it's not quite the same it was in the 1960s on that.
Hello, thank you. I have a few questions. I wanted to refer back to the Elon Musk and the possibility of the exploration of Earth. I know that you mentioned about a possible war coming. What would happen? Because doesn't it take like quite a few years to get to Mars? And what happens if by the time like they're on their way back, like the war's over, or if the Earth is at like a point where like it's uninhabitable? And another question would be, if these 100 people, I know you stated that they could possibly be families, wouldn't it be a hard time repopulating if a lot of them are families?
Sure. I mean, I'll admit, I didn't mean that to be a very precise scenario, but what Musk has suggested is, the most likely way that something really terrible and really fast would happen on Earth would be doing it to ourselves in a war. Because fortunately, we have now surveyed looking for, killer asteroids, dinosaur killer size asteroids And we're really pretty sure that there's no threat like that in the near future. My thought is you're absolutely right that, I mean, the literal image of like Earth shooting a missile at Mars, there would be a long time before it would actually get there. But it's still not clear to, what I think is, if things have really gone that badly on Earth, it's easy, one option is the colonists on Mars go, boy, that's terrible. We need to work together and cooperate. It's also possible they go, hey, you're from the country that just nuked my country, and they end up fighting on Mars too. Or as there gets to be a large enough society on Mars, they have their own conflicts over things. And you're at, this notion that if everybody on Earth is dead in a nuclear war, people can come back from Mars and rebuild Earth. I think you're absolutely, I'm skeptical that we will colonize and terraform Mars anytime soon. Doing that in reverse too, same thing, a few spaceships with a few dozen families, that's not going to get you very far.
If national security is a major motivator for space activity, how come our technology has declined to the point where we have to buy RD-180 rocket engines from Russia in order to launch our reconnaissance satellites so we could see what's going on in Russia?
Yeah, the details of how we've ended up there, I'm not up onto the point that I want to go through any kind of details, but yeah, just because we say it's about national security doesn't mean we're good at doing it. And yeah, I think we've had a lot of mismanagement. This is a huge problem for DoD generally. How come President Trump is entirely reasonable in pointing at the Navy and saying, how come your new $11 billion aircraft carrier doesn't work? That's, his particular points about why are you using steam? Why aren't you using steam like details aside, we've really not been, or the SLS program where, we clearly have an issue at the government, with large government technology projects. Everything from the Federal Aviation Administration updating the air traffic control system, to developing new boosters, to all the F-35 or the new aircraft carriers. Partly we've become too willing to kind of just say, that's great. When a contractor screws up massively, first of all, the culture is not to really hold them accountable. And if we put Boeing and Lockheed out of business, who would you then call? There's nobody else. So we've let the industry get so concentrated that you have a few giant companies that, for one thing, employ a whole lot of the retired military or former civil servants, who move on to better paying corporate jobs. We don't, we have lost a lot of the ability to really make accountability work. But yeah, I agree entirely that it's, that is particularly a good illustration of this larger problem.
I'd like to ask about the politics of international collaborations.
Sure.
And the International Space Station is the prime example. We've been up there for 20 years, 16 countries involved in this, and our participation with Russia, in spite of all the weird politics, we still are launched on the Russian side, we collaborate, and it's as if it lives in a different world. So I'm wondering, is the International Space Station a sort of a bizarre different thing than what you're seeing from a total national focus, or is it really a harbinger of a much larger international collaboration in space?
Yeah, it really, that we have the tension with Russia that we do, and ISS has not been very effective. It's good, it's interesting. They're every now and then, I think with the Russians, they've raised the price of getting up there. But yeah, clearly the Russians think it's pretty valuable too. Yeah, I think it's got so much institutional, support and inertia on both sides. I mean, I don't see us anytime soon, like putting up little walls between compartments and saying, Russians on this side, Americans on that side. Where I think you'll see the national security focus matter more is in not developing relationships with China. In fact, we already have legislation that makes it pretty strongly restricts space cooperation with China. Some of you may know Brown University's got one of the best planetary science departments in the country. And I go to talks there now and then, and they're all excited. Some of their people are working closely with China on their lander that's on the far side of the moon right now. And then I hear, on the national security side, we got to stop letting Chinese graduate students into the country. I'm not sure where that's going to go, but I think I predict we will not see a lot of U.S.-Chinese cooperation developing. I think ISS is so far along that it does have pretty much a life of its own at this point.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I know there are probably more questions, but it's also time to take a break. I think everyone will appreciate that. So I want to say thank you again, Dr. Burbach.